Hello everyone, and welcome back to another Strategoi video. Ryan here with a solo MathHammer installment, but this time we'll be picking up where we left off last video, where we broke down an example warscroll for its melee potential. There, we saw how strong our friendly Phoenix Guard can be, but their tanky reputation truly precedes them, so we have indeed saved the best for last. Not that this will be our last MathHammer video in the series, far from it. Stay tuned for the conclusion of this video for even more details of what's yet to come. But before I get ahead of myself, if you want to keep in touch, join our Strategoi Discord, where Jonas himself and I will be happy to chat with you there. And please do subscribe if you want to stay up to date. Let's take a look at where we're headed in this video installment for our example warscroll analysis. First, we'll explore the basic defensive properties of our tanky Phoenix Guard, including both basic and ward saves, as well as a brief look into the mechanics of defensive buffs like Mystic Shield and All-Out Defense. Next, we'll take our first look into quantifying our unit's wounds absorption stats, both in and of themselves and relative to their points cost, followed by a brief look at the impact of Battle Shock after the dust has settled. Lastly, now that we'll have finished our first not-so-feral foray into warscroll analysis, we're going to take a look at potential topics yet to come in this ongoing series, hopefully whetting your appetite for even more MathHammer juiciness. Now that we're on the defensive, so to speak, we should of course begin with the regular save. Let's start by assuming our opponent's attacking unit, boo, how dare they fight back, has no rend. We know our 4+ save characteristic blocks an incoming attack on a 4, 5, or 6 on a d6. So that equates to 3 out of 6 times, or 1/2 of the time when simplified. This means, on average, in order to kill one of our 1-wound models, that rendless wimp will have to get 2 whole attacks through there to hit and wound gates. And for a unit of 10 of our guys, that means 20 attacks worth of dice will have to get passed on to our boys, or ladies, to make our saving throws. But what if they have some rend, perhaps -1? Well, our guys' saving throws go from a 4+ to a 5+, or from a 3 out of 6 chance of blocking the attack to a 2 out of 6. Therefore, we will end up blocking 1/3 of the incoming attacks when simplified. Now, here the math gets a little less intuitive than it was with the 4+ save, as we don't multiply our wounds characteristic by an obvious value like 2. Instead, we need to look at it from the perspective of the attacker, and thinking of what the chance is that his attack will go through, again with 1 point of rend. So instead of it being a 2 out of 6 that we successfully make the save roll, we need to subtract this value from 1, or 6/6 if you prefer to have a common denominator, as seen in the chart, to get a 4/6 chance the attacker makes the attack actually go through. Then, we simply divide our wounds characteristic of 1 by this value, so 1 divided by 4/6, to get the amount of wounds the single Phoenix Guard can take before dying. If we want to quickly convert this to a multiplier for use with the original wounds characteristic, simply flip the chance that we fail the save, or in other words 4/6, over, making it 6/4, which in math is called taking the reciprocal. And then let's turn this 6/4 into a decimal value, in other words 1.5. By the way, if you don't believe me that this works, just try it with the 4+ save example above. So divide 1 by 3/6, or compute the multiplier directly as 6/3, which of course equals 2. Without lingering on the math too much longer, I'll just reference the chart here to see what our wounds absorption with our regular saving throw would look like for all common levels of rend. As you can see, each time the rend gets stronger, we end up having to divide our unit's wounds characteristic of 1 by an increasingly larger fraction over 6, effectively making our wounds absorption value smaller along the way. For example, at the last value of rend -3, our 4+ save defenders end up having no way to make a successful saving throw, leaving them with only their actual wounds characteristic of 1 as their functional wounds absorption value. Speaking of which, you're going to hear me frequently refer to the concept of wounds absorption when discussing such matters. This is simply a fancy way of saying that we're going to come up with a new, more thorough way of looking at the trio of wounds characteristic, save characteristic, and ward saves in a holistic manner that allows us to better come to terms with how long our toys have before we sadly have to put them away prematurely. In other areas of the Warham's interwebs, you might hear people refer to the same topic as effective wounds, so please just know that they could be used interchangeably. Now, like many things in this world of MathHammer, I have my own way of notating this sort of thing on each unit's warscroll page in my own battle tomes. In this case, I use a 4-value list of numbers in brackets that looks like this: 2, then 1.5, then 1.2, and then ending with 1, where each entry represents my unit's wounds absorption against increasingly stronger rend. So the 2 is against no rend, the 1.5 against rend -1, and so on. There are many great uses for this notation, but I'll spare you the details for now. That said, we shouldn't be too quick in writing this wounds absorption summary on the Phoenix Guard War Scroll, because we have yet to take into account their ward save. So, though a basic 4+ save is nothing to scoff at, it's not the primary reason our Phoenix boys appear to be able to rise from the ashes, or at least avoid becoming them. And that's entirely due to their fantastic 4+ after save, which we in Age of Sigmar call a ward. Essentially, the ward save is an additional gatekeeping step after failed saving throws that we'll use after each of the attacking unit's successful attacks multiplied by their damage characteristics comes through. Furthermore, seeing as ward saves, unlike regular saving throws, aren't altered by either rend or mortal wounds, they make for a great last defense against death. The good news here is that we compute the ward save's wounds absorption value in the same manner we did with our regular saves above. Take the current level of wounds absorption you have for a given save and divide that by the chance of failing the ward save. For a moment, to make calculations easier and to just focus on the ward itself, let's say that our opponent's attacks have a rend of -3, effectively removing our first round of regular saves. So in this case, we have a wounds absorption value of 1 divided by 3/6, once again doubling our unit's effective wounds count from 1 to 2. And if you think about it for a sec, this makes sense that it has the exact same effect as our basic save without a ward against an attack with no rend, as both that and our current ward save were a 4+. So, to update the entirety of our previous wounds absorption list, all we have to do is divide each of those values by 3/6, or rather multiply each by 2, our multiplier for the 4+ save, leaving us with the following complete wounds absorption list of 4, then 3, then 2.4, and then 2.0. This effectively means that to kill a single Phoenix Guard, an attacking unit with no rend will have to hand you, on average, 4 attacks worth of dice to make saves for, or even if they have a rend of -3 or better, which would be mortal wounds, they'd still have to make you roll 2 ward saves to kill a single model. Furthermore, this means that a unit without rend would have to hand you 40 dice on average to kill your whole unit of 10 models. Tanky elf bastards, right? Alright, so just for the sake of being thorough, let's examine how this would look if we got either Mystic Shield or All-Out Defense off on our Phoenix Guard, or perhaps even both. While I'm going to save the computations for a more thorough video yet to come, here are the results in this chart. So as you can see, if our unkillable wonders had either an all-out defense or a mystic shield on them, they'd each be able to absorb 6 wounds at no rend, putting their max unit wounds absorption at 60 for 10 models. Pretty insane. But what happens if we put both buffs on at the same time? Well, seeing as we're never allowed to have a net gain of more than +1 on our saving throws, this means we're capped at a 3+ save with a 4+ ward, but now we effectively get to ignore rend -1. This can be seen in the wounds absorption list as having a wounds absorption of 6 for the first 2 entries instead of just the first, effectively meaning against both no rend and rend -1. This is what we call ignoring rend -1. While this would perhaps be putting too many eggs in one basket and giving them all-out defense would make it so that they wouldn't be able to use the all-out attack we computed in the last video on melee output, this still illustrates how tough our Phoenix kin can be, if needed. As we saw in our previous video on offensive potential, if we can quantify an element of a unit and that unit has points, then we can almost certainly connect those 2 dots and come to some even more useful conclusions. And of course, the same can be said for our Phoenix Guard's wounds absorption value of 4, 3, 2.4, and 2 after we've taken into account their basic saves and their wards. Let's first start by multiplying each element in our wounds absorption list by 10 to represent the amount of wounds in a minimum sized unit, giving us 40, 30, 24, and finally 20. As we did before in our previous video for melee output per point, let's take each of these values and divide them by the unit's current points cost of 175, giving us the following: 0.2286, 0.1714, and so on. As you can see, this once again isn't such a pretty result. So let's multiply by 100 to get their wounds absorption per 100 points instead, which I think you'll find looks a good bit cleaner, at 22.86, 17.14, and so on. Naturally, we can round these off if we like, but since I'm a fan of keeping things at 2 decimal places for better comparison with units we'll later analyze, let's keep it this way for now. Admittedly, this metric is a good bit lengthier than our simpler offensive-oriented variant, so if you want to just simplify it to the outer 2 values, for least and most powerful rend, then that could be another good way to get to the heart of the matter. So, is there any way we can use this analytical tool outside of just comparing 2 different units' wounds absorption superiority? Well, yes, young Padawan, there most certainly is. For an example using information that's fresh in our minds, let's take the mirror matchup between our friendly unit of Phoenix Guard on the defense against a rogue, evil variant that dares to fight us. Well, starting with simple unit-to-unit calculations, all we have to do is remember what our pure output for a unit of 10 was in our previous video, not against a given save, but pre-rend, as I prefer to use this statistic. And then, using the amount of rend implied by that stat, in this case -1, compare it to our simple unit wounds absorption chart to see if it's enough to wipe out our defensive good guys. So, our previously calculated raw output per 10 Phoenix Guard was a 9.33 at a -1 rend. And comparing that with the second entry of the 40, 30, 24, 20 list, so the entry corresponding to rend -1, we see that 9.33 wounds is just under a third of the 30 wounds they would need to do to wipe our unit off the battlefield. So good news indeed, right? The short takeaway from this example is that Phoenix Guard can take more than they dish out. And that's a hint for future videos that this ratio will in fact be a metric we can use to good effect down the road. Furthermore, even at their most buffed, we saw that they were only putting out 15.56 at -1 before the save, which is still hovering around half what they would need to do to remove their doppelgangers off the field. And don't forget, this is all without taking into account any further defensive buffs as we described earlier. But what about our wounds absorption per 100 points version of the analysis? Where does that come in handy? Well, this is where we can compare a unit's offensive capabilities against our unit's defensive traits relative to how much we paid for them. While a bit more abstract of a concept to wrap our heads around, this gives us a way to see how efficient our unit is in sticking around, which of course is helpful for not only holding objectives, denying battle tactics, and creating screens for our more delicate units, but also sticking around to fight back with all those offensive buffs we discussed last time. And speaking of sticking around, while we're going to reserve most of this topic for a future video fully dedicated to the bravery/battle shock relationship, we would be remiss not to include this aspect here in our defense-oriented half of our Phoenix Guard breakdown, as they once again excel in this arena. For starters, as we noted last time, if they're standing wholly within 12 inches of a friendly anointed, any of his 3 varieties in fact, then Phoenix Guard are completely immune to battle shock, so the rest of what I'm about to mention is irrelevant, but only in that case. But let's say that your opponent manages to remove that anointed, or that your hero has to move away from the pack. Well, then we fall back to our decent bravery characteristic of 7, which is further bolstered to an 8 if the standard bearer remains in the unit, which he probably will be considering how tanky they all are. A note here, in computing the values we're about to look at, I'm going to assume the last model you remove is the standard bearer, just so that we keep that bravery 8 the whole time. So let's take a look at the chart on screen, showing us the relationship between the number of models lost in a unit with Bravery 8 relative to all potential battle shock rolls you might end up making for them. Included in this chart are the number of models that will flee under a given dice roll scenario, the expected value of how many will run for each of those scenarios, and the expected amount of models that will be left standing in that scenario if that turn you started with a full unit of 10 Phoenix Guard. Of particular interest would be that your elves are completely safe from losing any further models so long as they lose no more than 2. And even after that, though the expected value does increase, it'll still take a few more dying before it likely makes a notable dent on your dudes. Again, we'll cover more about Battle Shock later on down the road, but I feel this gives us a decent sense for the morale of our arisen heroes on the battlefield. And that about does it for our Phoenix Guard War Scroll analysis over the course of 2 videos. Hopefully I went gently enough on you all, and this breakdown leaves you more inspired to keep learning about and applying MathHammer in your own games. While we ended up going pretty deep into the weeds with this one, we obviously can't do this for every unit, but the good news is that once you get the gist of how MathHammering a unit out works, it gets way faster the next time around. As a point of reference, upon receiving a new battle tome, let's say the recent Ideneth Deepkin or Daughters of Cain books, it only takes me a couple hours to fully digest the units on a War Scroll level, more or less going into the same level of detail you've seen here per unit, and all without using anything more than a calculator and a pen. And as for future videos on this channel, my intention is to delve into some of the following topics listed here, with the very next video series being entitled Everything You Ever Wanted to Know About a D6. And trust me, there's probably going to be at least 2 videos on that because it gets pretty crazy, and I do want to try to keep these videos shorter moving forward. So looking at the list here, you can see we'll be talking about 2d6 rolls, which of course kind of naturally goes into spell casting, then some more advanced War Scroll analysis, a Monte Carlo combat simulation that'll be run with brute force techniques in Python code, using Excel in your math hammering, and evaluating existing online tools, in addition to others, of which I am always open to suggestions for things you would find interesting. In the meantime, thank you for your interest and support in both the channel at large and these MathHammer videos, and please leave your comments and questions in the comment section below. Like and subscribe, and don't forget to hit that notification bell. We're super psyched about this project, and like the phoenixes of our lore, we hope to light an undying MathHammer flame in you as well. Until next time, Ryan out.